Good morning. 26. 26 is how long my list was for this year. I had 26 coworkers to get gifts for this year. Now, I should explain that I take the easy way out for that. My daughter, who loves to bake and is insanely good at decorating, she offers to make cupcakes for them. So she makes cupcakes and peppermint bark for all 26 people on my list. And she even puts them in little decorative boxes and everything. And all I have to do is pay for the ingredients and hand out the boxes. And I also, while I do that, I assure people that I did not make these myself. They're safe to eat. Where I work, my daughter's cupcakes, they're like a thing now, because I've done this for a few years. When I made the deliveries this past Thursday, several people were like, "Oh, is it cupcake day? I love your daughter's cupcakes." And then there's two more gifts I have to get. I get a little something extra for my boss, because, and I get a little something extra for the person that I supervise. And I try to make those gifts a little bit more personal, a little more valuable, because the best gifts you can get, they're all about you, right? And the best gifts you can give are all about the person who's receiving the gift. Let me give you an example. Actually, let me give you a counterexample. I love the movie Die Hard. It's one of my top 5 Christmas movies, along with Christmas Vacation. Yay. And Iron Man 3. It's true, Now my wife, she hates Die Hard. She doesn't hate it, but she thinks it's stupid. And she thinks it's kind of dated. She's wrong, but I love her. And she's totally allowed to have her own opinion about Die Hard, even if it's not the right one. But for Christmas this year, if I were to buy her the complete Die Hard box set, with all 5 movies on DVD and Blu-ray, with director's commentary and special features and maybe like a little Bruce Willis Christmas tree ornament, she wouldn't be all that thrilled. Because that gift wouldn't be about her at all, that would be about me. On the flip side, if she gave me a package on Christmas morning and I opened it up to find the Best of the Weather Channel or Children's Ministry Sunday School Songs Greatest Hits, I'd be kind of annoyed, because I find those things kind of annoying. Because gift giving, it should be an expression of love. It's an act of service when it's done right. And I think that there are some lessons we can learn about worship and how we approach Jesus by talking about giving gifts. This morning we're going to just about wrap up our Advent series by taking a look at one of the weirdest stories in the Bible, and it's also one of my favorite stories in the Bible, possibly because it's one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. Whether you know them as the Magi, the wise men, or the mysterious visitors from the East, these strange gift givers, they can teach us some important things about how we worship Jesus and about the gifts that we bring him. Now, just as a side note, I'm going to brag a little bit here. I took a half vacation day on Friday to go see the new Star Wars movie, and it was awesome. I loved it. And I want you all to know how hard I worked all weekend to avoid making a terrible joke where I mix up Magi and Jedi. Okay? I didn't do it because I'm better than that. I fought off the Never mind. This is part 4 in our 5-part Advent series. And if you want to hear part 5, like we said earlier, you'll need to join us over in Landisville on Tuesday at 1 o'clock or 7 o'clock. I know some of you might be on the fence about it, or it might seem weird to go to some other church for Christmas Eve, but I would really, really encourage you to come. We'll be singing some traditional Christmas carols. I'll be leading the Landisville worship team, and Becky's going to join us for a few songs as well. Pastor Tim's going to bring the message, and we'll have a candlelight rendition of Silent Night. And the past couple of years, there have been snacks, so, there's that. But let's get back to the Magi. Before we dig into the text this morning, there's a couple things that I want to clear up. Over the centuries, the Magi have had their story kind of expanded and embellished from what we find in the Bible. And a good bit of what some people believe about the Magi isn't true at all, or at least is not in the Bible. And I think we can blame a song for a lot of the misunderstandings. We Three Kings of Orient Are is a fun, catchy song, and we might even do it on Christmas Eve. But there's some questionable material in there. For starters, they weren't kings. Matthew calls them magi, or visitors from the east, depending on what translation you're looking at. It's much more likely that they were advisors to kings. In some of those Old Testament passages where like the kings would call on their magicians and their advisors and their astrologers to interpret their dreams and stuff like that, these guys were much more likely in that kind of role. Very high-ranking people, but not kings. Secondly, the Bible mentions 3 gifts that the Magi brought. We're going to talk about them in detail later on. But the number of visitors is never mentioned. A lot of people just assume that each guy was carrying 1 gift. All we know from the text is that there was more than 1. It could have been 2 guys carrying 3 gifts, or it could have been 100 guys carrying 3 gifts. We don't know. Third, they are not named in the Bible. Somebody decided a long time ago that their names are Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Tuck that away for Trivial Pursuit. And that's become a tradition among some and a firm belief among others. That's assuming, again, that there were only 3, but as far as we know from Matthew, they might as well have been Larry, Curly, and Moe, the 3 wise guys, or John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Matthew does not bother to give us their names. Lastly, and this is the one that grinds my gears the hardest, the Magi never visited Jesus in the manger. Didn't happen. I know they're in every nativity scene, and we seem to have them wrapped up in the Christmas story. But as we'll see in a couple minutes, Matthew lays out a very different scenario. So to put it plainly, this sermon on the Magi should be part of an Advent series from 2017, if we're going to get the timeline right. It was that much later, but we'll get to that. So who were these guys, and what exactly was going on? And why did they bring Jesus such weird gifts? Let's open up the scriptures and see what we can discover. We're going to start this morning with the first 8 verses of Matthew chapter 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem, search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me, so that I can go and worship him too." Let's be clear about one thing right off the bat. Herod had no intention of worshiping Jesus. Herod is basically like a movie villain in this story, okay? He might as well have been sitting in an oversized chair and stroking a mean-looking cat for what he contributes to the story. He's basically like a Bond villain. I know that's Dr. Evil from Austin Powers, not a Bond villain. That was the best picture I could find. Now, just to make things extra confusing, this guy's name is Herod. And there's multiple Herods in the Bible. And it's super easy to get confused with what's going on. There's King Herod in this morning's passage, and he was also known as Herod the Great, which is probably a nickname that he gave himself. You may recall another Herod from later when Jesus is on trial. He's the guy who passes Jesus back and forth with Pontius Pilate. His name's Herod too. That's Herod Antipas, who was the grandson of Herod the Great. So they were related, but they weren't the same guy. And all these Herods together make up what's called the Herodian dynasty, which was founded by the delightful fellow we find calling himself the king of Judea, Herod the Great. See, Herod, he wanted to be the king of the Jews. That's why he reacted the way he did when the Magi asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. Herod would have been thinking, newborn king of the Jews? Well, that sounds like a threat. That sounds like a challenger to my throne. Now, never mind the fact that it was really just a puppet government, and he was allowed to call himself king because the Romans didn't care enough to stop him. But Herod goes digging to find out more about this possible throne stealer. Usurper, that's the word I should use there, that's a good word. Possible usurper. And learns that the prophecies were pointing to Bethlehem as the birthplace. The religious experts that Herod calls upon quote from the book of Micah, when they say, in Bethlehem in Judea, they say, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you, who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. So Herod, being the Bond villain that he is, he sends the Magi on a quest. Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me, so that I can go and worship him too. But like I said, Herod has no intention of worshiping Jesus. He just wants to protect the power that he's managed to gain. And we'll see in a few minutes just how cruel and heartless and vicious Herod was willing to be to protect his throne. For now, let's continue on with verses 9 through 11. After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We're going to talk about these weird gifts in a couple minutes, but I want to point out two important words in this passage. They entered the house and they saw the child with his mother. House and child are pretty interesting words, I think. Because like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people assume that the Magi were at the manger that first Christmas, because it just comes right after that in the text. But you can blame that on We Three Kings or the people who design nativity sets or the people who make claymation Christmas shows or whatever. But the fact is, this was later. The Magi found Jesus in a house, not in a barn. And Matthew says they saw him as a child, not as a baby. Some scholars believe they arrived up to 2 years after Jesus was born. So even though some nativity sets are as crowded as Woodstock, the Magi weren't there that night. Let's look at verses 12 to 18. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother, the angel said. Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. I called my son out of Egypt. Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Rhine, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead. And this is where we see what kind of man Herod the Great really was. Magi head out of town without reporting back to Herod. So Herod dispatches his troops, and he did have Roman soldiers at his disposal. He dispatches his troops to kill every boy, age 2 and younger, in Bethlehem and around Bethlehem. Now, this is also a guy who killed several of his own sons, 3 of his own sons. He had religious leaders executed several times. There was a Roman historian named Macrobius who wrote that you were safer being Herod's pig than being Herod's son. Now, we don't know for sure how many kids were slaughtered. Some historians think it was as many as 3,000. Some say the number was as low as 6 or 7. We really don't know. Bethlehem was not a huge town, but I think we can all agree here this morning that killing one innocent child puts you over the line from good guy to bad guy. Can we all agree on that? Like, one is enough. This morning we lit the candle of love. I think it's appropriate that we take a few moments this morning to talk about how we show love, not just to each other, but to Jesus. And I think that these mysterious visitors from the East, with their weird gifts, can teach us about the right way to show love to Jesus. We don't know where the Magi came from exactly. I've read some really interesting theories that they came from Babylon, and that they read about Jesus' birth in some of Daniel's writings from when he was there during the exile. But it's hard to say for sure. But we know that it was a long journey, because almost any trip back then was a long journey. They didn't hop on a bus or a plane to get to Jerusalem. It was a long journey. And you see, worship is not an event. It's not something that happens once a week on a schedule in a certain place. It's a way of life. Now the Magi, we don't know how long they were traveling, but it wasn't just a simple trip to Sunday service. This was a deep commitment on their part. It became a lifestyle, at least for a season. And worship needs to become a lifestyle for each of us as well. It's more than a song. It's more than a gathering of believers. It's a way of life. Worship is not an event. There's another thing about worship that we can learn from the Magi. The three gifts that they brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They're not cheap. Gold, obviously, is expensive. But these were not little trinkets that they picked up at the Bethlehem Welcome Center gift shop on their way to see Jesus. These were fairly expensive commodities. And I think that reminds us that worship has a cost. See, if it doesn't cost you anything, it's probably not worship. A really good example of this can be found in the book of 2 Samuel. There's a long backstory that we don't have time to dig into real far today, but King David had made God very, very angry. And the way things turned out, David needed to build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of someone in his kingdom. So David approached the man and he said, "Look, I need to buy this property from you so that I can build an altar to the Lord right here on your threshing floor. How much?" And the man looked at King David and he said, No, you're the king. Just take it. Just say it's yours. Because kings could do that kind of thing. They could just come in and take your property. That's why it's good to be king. But King David, he was offended by that. And I love his response. He said to the man, "No, I insist on buying it, for I will not present burnt offerings to the Lord my God that have cost me nothing." So King David paid him a fair price, even though he could have just taken it for himself. See, worship has a cost. If a gift didn't cost you anything, what good can that be? And this doesn't just mean a financial cost. We're not just talking about money. It could be time. It could be effort. It could be an emotional cost. But there's always a cost. So these gifts were expensive. They were also very specific. And kind of weird, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was about 2 years old when the Magi arrived. What kind of weirdo gives a toddler gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Who does that? These are terrible presents for a little kid. But they had a lot of meaning. This is another one of those things that just can become part of the background of Christmas: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But each of those things had a very special meaning. And if we look at each one, we can see that worship puts the focus on Jesus. Let's start with gold. Gold is a gift for a king. The Magi presented their gold to the King of Kings. The gold represents that Jesus is the greatest king that there will ever be. Now, frankincense is a type of incense, and it was used frequently in worship services used by the priests. And the Magi gave Jesus frankincense because he is worthy of all worship. The frankincense represents that Jesus is Lord and high priest. But wait, there's myrrh. I couldn't resist. Myrrh was slightly less expensive than frankincense, and its primary use was not in worship services. It was typically used in the embalming process. It was used to get bodies ready for burial. That's kind of a morbid gift for a 2-year-old kid. but it's a pretty powerful reminder that this child had come to die. This toddler they came to worship came to earth to die for our sins. We don't always like to think about that at Christmas time. See, we like baby Jesus, snuggled up in a manger, resting in Mary's arms. But the myrrh reminds us that this baby will grow up and be crucified. He would die a terrible, painful, gruesome death to save us. And we don't like to think about that Jesus. The one who's covered in blood and wounds. The one who was beaten and whipped. See, that Jesus reminds us of our sin. It's easier to think about the cute baby because this cute baby doesn't challenge us at all. We don't like to think about Jesus on the cross at Christmas, but that's why Christmas happened. That's the whole reason he came. Jesus told us to remember his death. He told us to remember his resurrection. He told us to look for his coming, but he never said anything about celebrating his birthday. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's important to remember that we have Christmas so that we can have Easter. And to remember that worship puts the focus on Jesus and on who he is. There's one other thing about worship that we need to look at this morning. Worship is a war cry. You might think I'm overstating things, but I'm not. We have an enemy, and we are at war. And there are casualties in this war. Think of all the boys that lost their lives because of Herod's jealousy. Jealousy is a really big part of this war because that's what our enemy really wants, is our worship. But our worship is only for Jesus. So worship to Jesus, that's a battle cry as we charge against the enemy. It's our shout of defiance as we face off against the powers of this world. And it's important to remember that we don't have to do the fighting ourselves. Jesus does the fighting for us. He fights the battles, and we shout for joy to Jesus because of that. We raise up a war cry because our worship changes the atmosphere and it pushes back against the darkness. James tells us to resist the devil and he will flee from us. But how do we resist the devil? By putting your focus on Jesus, by worshiping him and him alone. Worship is a war cry. And this little boy, being adored by the Magi, he was a sneak attack in this war. This was a move that the enemy was not expecting. Now, whether you call them Magi, or wise men, or mysterious visitors from the east, or even if you insist on calling them kings, even though they totally weren't, these strangers and their gifts, they teach us a lot about worship. And it's worth pointing out here that they weren't believers. They weren't coming from a Jewish tradition. They were outsiders. Remember, the shepherds were outsiders too. Then let's throw in a small-town carpenter with a heart of gold and a teenage girl who wants to serve God with everything she has. And we end up with a crew of misfits that hardly seems like they're going to change the world. But they did. And this unexpected group of outsiders and misfits was written into God's story. This group of misfits led the troops into the battle, and their general was a baby boy. You see, God loves to use the people you'd never expect to do the things you'd never anticipate. Shepherds shared the good news first. A young carpenter was chosen to be the father to the Son of God. A teenage girl was selected to carry the Messiah into the world. And strangers from a foreign land came to teach us how to worship this king and to remind us of why he came. Now, aside from being the ones you wouldn't expect, this crew all had something in common. They were all willing to be used by God. They all said yes when God came calling. When the angels told the shepherds about the newborn king, the shepherds shouted yes, and they ran into the village. When the angel told Mary she was going to be the virgin mother of the Savior, she said yes and submitted herself to God. When the angel told Joseph to go ahead and take Mary as his wife, he said yes And he did it right away. And before all that, when the star rose and the Magi saw it, they said, yes, this is the sign that we've been waiting for. Let's hit the road. God is asking you to do something. Maybe you're having trouble figuring out what it is, or maybe you do know and you're just fighting it. But God is calling you. And I want to encourage you this morning to say yes. I know he's calling me to something. I think I know what it is. I'm terrified to say yes to it. But the final message in our Advent series is going to be this Tuesday evening at the Christmas Eve service at the Church of God at Landisville. I'll be there. I hope you come, because you'll want to know how this whole story ends, and I'm not going to give you any spoilers. But really, I know it might seem weird to go to another church to worship on Christmas Eve, but I figure if the Magi can travel that far to worship a kid and bring him their gifts, we can make it to Landisville. So, let's wrap up this morning by reviewing these 4 points about worship that we learned from the Magi. First, worship is not an event. It's a journey, and it's a way of life. Second, worship has a cost. It might be money, it might be time, it might be something else. But if it doesn't have a cost, it probably isn't worship. Third, worship puts the focus on Jesus and on who he is. Gold for a king, frankincense for the high priest, and myrrh for the Savior who would die for us. Lastly, worship is a war cry. Shout praises to Jesus as we enter the battle. Fight back the darkness and change the atmosphere with your worship. And one more thing. When God calls, say yes. Let's pray.